Good morning. I want to talk briefly about Peggy MacIntosh's white privilege. I think this reading is fairly straightforward, but I do want to make sure that I mention a couple of important things from the reading. This will probably be a fairly short video, but I'd like to go ahead and hit some of the main points of MacIntosh's piece. Her thesis here is that like male privilege, white privilege is largely unacknowledged, and describing white privilege makes one accountable. So MacIntosh draws a parallel between what she sees as male privilege and how she experiences that, and how she is able to identify white privilege in her own life. In the same way that male privilege is unacknowledged and often unconscious and unintentional, white privilege is also highly unacknowledged, even if unconscious. And she believes that accounting for white privilege can make one responsible for one's own privilege and how that contributes to the systematicity of racism in our society. So why does MacIntosh write a list of 46 ways in which she believes she personally experiences white privilege? And note that she's not making this list as a universal list that everyone experiences. This is her experience, yours will be different, but by taking this approach, she is trying to show that it's hard to deny not only that racism exists in our society and is systemic, but that white privilege is definitely something that people with white, light skin have in our society. And although the ways in which you experience that might be slightly different than the ways that MacIntosh experiences it, after reading her account, it's hard to deny that whites have a kind of privilege that contributes to racism in our society. So she writes this list because she sees the ways in which men are not accountable for their privilege, even if they are sympathetic to women who are fighting the good fight against sexism in our society. They don't identify with the fact that they themselves have privilege as males. And so she sees a parallel here between the way in which males are not accountable for their privilege, even if they do acknowledge sexism. And so their work to improve women's status is not entirely helpful because they're not willing to lessen men's privilege. And male privilege is the other side of the coin of sexism. And so similarly, MacIntosh is able to identify the ways in which white privilege is the other side of the coin of racism. And so discussions about racism are helpful, but they're only part of the issue unless we acknowledge that whites have certain unearned privileges. We can't actually get at systemic racism. So she wants to show that in the same way that she believes that men need to be held accountable for their privilege, whites have to be accountable for their privilege as well. She argues that, like men, whites have this kind of invisible knapsack, this weightless knapsack full of privileges and resources that are completely unearned. Doors open for whites in the way that doors open for men without any effort on their part. Just by virtue of being white, a person has certain privileges open to them, whether they ask for them or not, whether they're aware of them or not. In the same way that men have privileges available to them, whether they ask for them or not, and whether they're aware of them or not. Many of these privileges are unconscious because we're not educated in such a way that we're trained to see ourselves as oppressors or as having certain privileges, as unfairly advantaged, or as participating in a culture that is damaged, that is racist or sexist. So in our culture, in the same way that males are seen as neutral and at the same time positive or ideal, normatively ideal persons, whites are seen as neutral and positively ideal persons. And non-whites are marked in the same way that women are marked. In the same way that women are marked with a kind of excess or inferiority, are often seen as irrational, emotional, non-rational. Non-whites are seen in similar lights. Of course, there are various stereotypes for various groups of persons, but there's a parallel here, not a sameness, but a parallel. And this is what MacIntosh is trying to show us. And so we have these privileges as whites that are unearned, and they're felt as a kind of sense of entitlement, that we're entitled to these things that we have, despite the fact that these privileges are not earned by us. Because there's this myth of meritocracy. In the same way that men believe that they have earned and they're entitled to these privileges that they have just by virtue of being a man, the doors that open for men simply because they're men are similar to the doors that open for whites just because they're whites. So life is not free. Life is not necessarily simply what one makes it because of systemic sexism in our society and systemic racism in our society, wherein males have a vast set of male privileges and whites have a vast set of white privileges. And MacIntosh wants to distinguish between positive privileges and negative privileges. So some of the things on her list, and I won't go over the list in detail, but some of the things on her list are positive privileges. Positive privileges are privileges that one would want for everyone in a just society. So, for example, belongingness. Everyone should feel a sense of belongingness. Everyone should feel that they can move somewhere and have neighbors that will treat them decently. Everyone should feel like their race won't count against them in court or in run-ins with police officers, that their race won't count against them when they're walking through a convenience store. And so these positive privileges are unearned advantages that everyone should have in an ideal society. So the reason that positive privileges are bad is simply that not all people have them. So there's a system of barriers in place. Recall Fry's account of oppression. There's a system of barriers in place preventing certain people from having the positive privileges that whites have and that males have. But some of these privileges, the positive ones, are privileges that ideally everyone ought to have. On the other hand, MacIntosh discusses negative privileges. These are privileges that allow someone to be ignorant, arrogant, destructive, oblivious, exclusionary, and these are privileges that nobody should have. So MacIntosh talks about the way that certain privileges that males have and certain privileges that whites have allow males and whites to ignore, to fail to grant credibility, and not to engage with others. And these kinds of privileges, negative privileges, distort the humanity of both the privileged person and the person being ignored or excluded or othered. So negative privileges confer a sense of dominance. They confer a sense of the permission to control others through an unearned sense of entitlement. And this creates ignorance and epistemic disadvantage. So it creates problems within knowledge ascription. Who knows what? Who's allowed to know what we think other people know, how we ascribe knowledge to other people in our society. Women are often not seen to know as much as men. They're not given the kind of credibility that men are. Similarly, blacks are often not given the kind of credibility that whites are in our society, and this is due to negative privilege. The entitlement that whites and males feel to ignore others, not to grant credibility to others, and to exclude others. So MacIntosh is concerned with what we can do to lessen the kind of negative privileges and increase the kind of positive privileges that males and whites have in our society. And she believes that by identifying how these privileges affect our everyday lives, how they damage both the victims and the victimizers, then we can mitigate the kind of negative privileges that have been granted to men and to whites in our society, and we can enlarge the positive privileges that ought to go to everyone in our society, but are limited to whites and males. So, on MacIntosh's view, racism affects you even if you're not the victim of racism. That is, she wants to be sure that we understand that whites also have a racial identity. White is a racial identity. So when we talk about race, we're not simply talking about blacks. White is a racial identity. In the same way that men ought to be concerned with sexism, because they're part of the system of sexism, a very important part, due to their sense of male privilege, whites ought to be concerned with racism, because whites are an important part due to white privilege. Whites are an important part of racism. So systems of privilege have universal effects, systemic effects, in addition to particular effects on particular people. So if you think back to Bartkey's essay, Bartkey's giving us an account of the ways in which we might look at the individual effects of sexism or racism on particular persons. The way that stereotyping, cultural domination, and sexual objectification can have psychological effects and psychically alienate individual persons. Fry's account, on the other hand, is going to give us a structural view of the way in which oppressions are systemic. We have to look at it from a macroscopic perspective. On MacIntosh's view, she's saying, look, if we're going to undo racism, if we're going to undo sexism, we have to account for white privilege and male privilege. And the way to do that is to realize that systems of privilege have universal effects. This is not just a concern for blacks, it's not just a concern for women. Racism is a concern particularly for whites, because it has effects on us as well. We are ignorant if we're not aware of the ways in which we have unearned privileges which confer a kind of entitlement to be dominant over, ignore, and exclude others. In the same way that systems of male privilege confer dominance to men. They feel an entitlement to ignore, exclude, and destruct women. In the same way that sexism is an issue for men, and it has effects on men, in that men are ignorant of their unearned privileges, many of which confer dominance on women, that upholds the system of sexism. Whites have to be aware of the ways in which they are ignorant of their privileges which confer dominance, and whether consciously or unconsciously give license to whites to be ignorant, arrogant, destructive, oblivious, and exclusionary to non-whites. So one of the important takeaways from MacIntosh's piece is that many of us think that, especially in the United States, given the American dream, that we're fighting for freedom and all of these kinds of mottos that we have here. MacIntosh is going to say that meritocracy is a myth. It's not the case that life is completely free, that people get what they deserve. The harder we work, the more we get. Life is not necessarily what one makes it, because doors open for people through no effort of their own. Being male already confers privilege. Doors open for you. Being white already confers privilege. Doors open for you without any effort on your part, whether you are aware of these privileges or not. So it's not the case that we live in a society that is a meritocracy. We have to acknowledge systems of sexism and systems of racism in our society.